Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to an SAME Internet or Environmental COI webinar. Resilience isn't what you have, it's what you do. A few administrative things before we get started. If you're connecting through a VPN, we recommend that you don't. You may have some problems. The audio is broadcast through your computer speakers, so turn them up. Use the chat tab on the control panel to submit technical issues. If you have any technical issues, you can reach out to us and we will try to resolve those. And look in the private tab for your response. If you have any written questions, we recommend you submit them in the Q&A tab. And you can upvote any questions that have already been asked to avoid duplication, but it also gives us an idea of what questions are most important to people. And this webinar will be recorded and available in our archives for your future viewing. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Alexis. Alexis?
Alexa Stone. Hi, everybody. Today's webinar is presented by the SAME Environmental Community of Interest, or COI. And I'm going to switch that slide to the next one here. You can find this community of interest at the link right there on your screen. The Environmental COI has a call on the third Wednesday of every month. And if you're considering joining a COI, I recommend this one. They've been very welcoming to me. I'm new to the group and just a really terrific group of individuals. Our next webinar will be PFAS in Air, which will be on December 15th. At 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 3 p.m. Central. I'd like to give a special thanks to Jane Huber, who is the Director of Programs for the Environmental Community of Interest, for her help in coordinating this event today. And I'd also like to thank Rob Biederman, Director of Industry, Government Engagement and Programs, who you heard from just a minute ago. My name is Alexis Stone, and I'm the founder of ecoPreserve, and we are a woman-owned small business focused on sustainability and resiliency. I'm very excited to be your moderator today on this topic. Throughout this webinar, you're going to see some polls, and those are there so we can learn a little bit more about your role in economic recovery. So before I introduce our most excellent speakers, let's go ahead and start off with a poll. You should all see that on your screen now. Now, Rob, where do I see the responses on the poll? Do you see them?
Hi, Alexa. Just click over to the open polls on the polls tab.
Mm-hmm. Do you see the responses for that one?
I do. So far, large businesses with 13, medium businesses with 11, small businesses with 8, civilians at government agencies 5, and active duty military 4.
Okay. Looks like we have a good cross-section on the call today, so fantastic. Our speakers today are Dr. Dave Alderson and Kirsten McGregor. Dave Alderson is the founding director of the Center for Infrastructure Defense at the Naval Postgraduate School. And he's a professor in the Operations Research Department there. He researches the function and operation of critical infrastructures, how to invest limited resources to ensure efficient and resilient performance in the face of accidents, disruptions, natural disasters, or deliberate attacks. He is the principal investigator of sponsored research projects for the U.S. Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. I got to tell you all, I have looked through this PowerPoint. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm very excited to hear his presentation. Thank you, Dave.
Okay, good morning. Can you all hear me okay? Alexa, coming through okay?
Coming through great. Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, great. So I want to thank Alexa, I want to thank Rob, I want to thank everybody at SAME for inviting me to be here today. As Alexa kind of mentioned, I'm going to try to tell you a lot about some of the work that's been going on in the space of critical infrastructure protection, and in particular, the way in which resilience pertains to that. And I'm going to try to give you some new ways of thinking about resilience, at least some that are maybe a little less prominent than what you maybe have seen before. So as mentioned, I am at the Naval Postgraduate School. We are a graduate research university located in Monterey, California. Our students are primarily mid-career military officers. And so you can kind of think of us like the graduate school equivalent of the Naval Academy, except that we focus on technical degrees primarily. And we're a joint command, so that we have students from all branches of service there, including international officers. I am in the operations research department, which is actually the oldest curriculum in operations research in the country. Operations research is a field that grew out of World War II. It essentially is, how do you make data-informed decisions? So everything that you hear today about analytics, machine learning, all these other kinds of things really has a lot of its origins in optimization and probability, and that all goes back to operations research. A quick shameless plug, our department is hiring. So if you or anyone you know is looking for a tenure track position in operations research, please do consider applying. And there's a link there for those who want to know more. Now, at the Naval Postgraduate School, I serve as director of a research center called the Center for Infrastructure Defense. Our website is there. And we focus on local, regional, in some cases, national critical infrastructure systems. So that is things like electric power systems, water systems, roads and bridges, other kinds of transportation and supply chain kinds of things. And we and my colleagues at the Naval Postgraduate School have been working on critical infrastructure going all the way back to the 1980s. And some of the initial work had to actually do with targeting of critical infrastructure. So if you wanted to disrupt an adversary's electric power system, how would you do it in a way that is most effective, not only for achieving some kind of disruptive effect, but also for, let's say, bringing it back online? And so a lot of the work that we do, at least initially, has been motivated by sort of adversarial approaches that we now take and look at our own infrastructures from this perspective to identify vulnerabilities and to figure out ways of making them more resilient to these kinds of disruptions. And a big term that's been used a lot in the last 15 years is that of resilience, and in particular, operational resilience. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. So it seems like nowadays, everyone is hearing about infrastructure and critical infrastructure, right? There's a lot of debate going on right now in Congress about various spending bills on infrastructure. So the study of infrastructure in the US has been going on for quite some time. I traced the modern study of it back to about the mid-90s. 1997, there was a presidential commission on critical infrastructure protection that brought together folks from government, the military, and academia and private industry, who were realizing that all of our critical infrastructure systems were now starting to become more and more interdependent because of this new thing called the internet, right? And with the internet, all of these systems that used to be sort of standalone and disparate are now interconnected in ways that are kind of subtle and that we don't always fully appreciate until things go on. So I've actually been involved in this since the time of the PCCIP, which sort of dates me a bit, I guess. But there's been a lot of progress during that time in terms of the way that we think about it. Immediately after 9/11, initially, a lot of the focus was simply on protection. And then with various natural hazard events, right, Hurricane Katrina and other kinds of things, it shifted a little bit to thinking about natural hazards. And it seems like today we have to worry about just about everything. So in the work that we do, there are three questions that come up again and again from various government agencies or military commands or others who want to know about their critical infrastructure. And the first of these questions has to do with assessing consequences. So what happens if? What happens if there is some kind of event? It could be an accident, it could be a natural disaster, if there's attack. What are the consequences going to be in terms of the performance of my infrastructure, or maybe in terms of damage or loss of life? So that's question number one. Question number 2 has to do with, tell me what are the most important things? What are the critical elements of my system? What are the critical components? And one of the things that we see over and over again is it's not just individual components that matter, but sets of components that work together. So a very simple example of this is someone might say, well, how important is this bridge across the river? And the answer is, I don't know. Is there another bridge right next to it, right? If you have 2 bridges, you could lose one or the other and have it not be a big deal. But if you lose them both, then it's catastrophic, right? So in general, it's hard to put a value on a single component to an infrastructure system, and you really have to look at that in the broader context. So question number 2 is identifying critical components. Question number 3 is, okay, I've got some budget that I can invest, and I want to make my system more resilient, right? Or maybe I need to be investing in hardening my system, or backups, or maybe I need to expand capacity. How do I think about these kinds of things? And so these 3 questions are things that we get over and over again, and they and the tools that we've developed address exactly that. So as a starting point, we need to talk a little bit about how we think about critical infrastructure. And one of the traditional ways, going all the way back to World War II in the 1950s and whatnot, is to simply think about list of assets. Tell me all the things that I have, right? I have roads, and I have bridges, and I have buildings, and I have power stations, right? And these kinds of things. And a lot of even Department of Defense guidance says that what you need to do is come up with prioritized ranked lists of these assets, come up with the most important and the second most important and the third most important and these kinds of things. And as a start, that might be an okay way to do it. But in fact, what we really prefer is that we think of these infrastructures as interconnected systems that work together to achieve a particular function. Because ultimately, what we want to do is we want to make our operations resilient to disruptive events. We don't necessarily care about the electric power substation. We care about the delivery of electricity to businesses and homes and to military installations. We don't necessarily care about the pumping station. We care about the delivery of potable water to the people in the places that need it. So how do we go about doing that? So the key thing in the approach that we take to thinking about infrastructure as systems is to take what we call an operational view. So we take the perspective of the owners and operators of these infrastructure systems who are actively managing, actively making decisions to have these systems perform their function and respond to challenges that come to them. So using language that is a bit more military in nature, right? We have systems, we have assets that work together as systems to create function. That function enables capability, and that capability ultimately supports mission. And so now the mission in this context, mission is a very military word, but I argue that civilian infrastructures have mission as well. And to the extent that we think about the way in which the components work together as systems to provide that function and capability, we can effectively think about the way in which these missions will be successful or potentially how they might fail. And so a lot of the work that I do has to do with building models to assess the capability of systems to continue to work even when they lose components under different kind of loss scenarios. And then that allows us to assess vulnerability. And then it also allows us to think about how we can invest to make these things more effective. Now, what about mission, you might ask? Well, mission, right, depends on, what is the mission? What defines mission success is all about stakeholders and stakeholder values. So depending on who it is that we work with, it's really important that we're in sync with them and that we understand what it is that ultimately is going to define success. And the key point here, that mission success is for the stakeholders, not the modelers like me. And so in order for us to improve the ability of these infrastructure systems to keep functioning, there are a number of ways that we do it, but one of the ways is to use adversarial models that we call system interdiction models. And I'm going to tell you just a very little bit about that. So a couple key ideas to start, right, is that focus on the delivery of services, not the mitigation of hazards or threats. And what do I mean by that? So there are some things that we need our infrastructure systems to do, right? We need them to deliver electricity. We need them to deliver fuel, or we need to be able to move people and goods, right? We need to be able to communicate, whatever it is, right? There are things that we need to do, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong, right? And these interdictions, these disruptions can be either from non-deliberate things, like extreme weather or accidents or failures, or they can be deliberate, right? We can have folks who are deliberately trying to interfere with us. And so one of the ways that we go through this is that we study the adversarial relationship to get insights about vulnerabilities and mitigation. So we'll often play the notional attacker, not because we're trying to predict what actual attackers might do, but because it becomes an effective way at discovering interdependencies that might otherwise be missed. It's fairly remarkable if you, when I talk to my students and I say, okay, we've been studying this system, tell me what's really, really important. And they say, well, I don't know, it could be this or it could be that, or everything's kind of important. And I turn the question around and I say, okay, tell me how you would break this. Suddenly their eyes light up and they're like, okay, I would do this and I would do that and I would do that. And suddenly now you've identified some interdependencies that are going to be problematic for the system no matter what happens. Again, it's not just bad guys, but oftentimes the problems that we face result when, this thing fails, when this other thing was down for maintenance at another time, when the supply chain was backordered and we couldn't get replacement parts or whatever it is, these strange confluence of events that cause problems. And so the question is, how do you start to identify those kinds of things in advance? Now, we have formal models that we have to do this. These are called attacker-defender models. And I'm not going to go into any of the details here, but essentially what we're doing is we're using a combination of game theory with large-scale optimization. So we actually consider individual players. We have one player who is the operator of the defender, and we have another one who's trying to attack it, and they both get to make decisions. So we're not using a kind of a random event or Monte Carlo simulation or this kind of thing. This is a sequential play game, and these attacker-defender models allow us to assess vulnerability. Defender-attacker-defender models allow us to assess the value of defensive investments and how much they actually help. And we've written a lot about this in the academic literature. If anyone's interested in learning more about that, please contact me and I'd be happy to share with you those references. So the key point, though, is that we've used these models to study lots and lots of different systems. The list on the right there in terms of applications gives you a sense of the utility of these kind of tools for studying lots of different kind of infrastructure systems. And we can study them at reasonable levels of fidelity. And we do it in a way that is consistent with the actual operators who are making decisions about them. So that is to say, when we're studying electric power system, we have to consider the physics of electricity, and we have to use the kind of models that electric power operators use. If we're studying water and water pipelines, we have to use hydrology models, right? If we're studying regional highway transportation, we have to look at the kind of transportation models, equilibrium kind of models that dictate traffic flows on highways, right? So it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of model, but the basic process and the technique has some similarities that we've been able to use over and over again, not only for standalone infrastructures, but for interdependent ones as well. Now, a couple of case studies just to give you a little context for this. So we studied a lot of different systems, a lot of different military as well as civilian systems. So one study we did a number of years ago was Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is in Central California. It's very important for space missions and other kinds of things. And the question at the time was related to the electric power system. So in particular, what could cause electric power outages at Vandenberg Air Force Base? And one of the things that we discovered was that because of the way that the physics of electricity works, and at least the way that the grid was connected at the time, even though Vandenberg had its own generation on base, it turned out that disruptions off in Central California elsewhere outside the fence could actually cause problems at Vandenberg. And so we wrote that up specifically. One of the things that was very important in that study was that we considered two different areas that could be affected. So there's the immediate base, inside the fence line, which is sometimes called the small boot print, as well as the broader surrounding community referred to here as the big boot print. And the key recognition is that even if you're able to maintain electric power on the installation, but the surrounding area is in darkness, that's still going to have consequences, because most of the people who work on the installation, of course, live in the community. Their families are in the community. And so we have to be considering not just the installation itself, but the resilience of the broader community. So electric power in Central California is one thing we've looked at. We've also done quite a bit of work studying islands. Islands are great topics of study because there are well-defined boundaries around them that don't necessarily exist in the lower 48. So we've looked at the electric power system, for example, on Guam. We've looked at the electric power system in Hawaii. In that case, again, using the kind of attacker models to identify vulnerabilities, thinking about the way in which you could harden components to make them more resistant to failure, as well as things like, well, if you were to be able to use spare parts, so in particular, these transformers that are really important electric power systems, they're very big, they're very expensive, they have very long lead times. And as such, utilities typically can't afford to have a bunch of them sitting around as spares. And so one of the questions is, okay, if you could afford to have a spare or two spares, how might you use them and how much would it actually help? Other systems that we've considered have to look at military fuel supply chains. And the basic idea would apply to any kind of supply chain, but in this particular body of work, we've been focused on the Pacific Theater, which has very large distances and requires a lot of fuel for both, in the Navy's case, ships and aircraft. And looking at the way in which various operational plans create demands by different types, fuel types, because the fuel for aircraft is different from the fuel for ships. And if you have demands over some notional campaign that might be 60, 90, 120 days, how do you, what is the capability of the supply chain to deliver fuel where it's needed, when it's needed, in the right amounts? And so we've done this looking at the Pacific Theater, looking, for example, at critical infrastructure on the island of Guam, supporting Anderson Air Force Base, as well as the broader global shipping network. So, for example, what happens if there's a problem in the Straits of Malacca? Or as we saw earlier this year, what happens when a ship grounds itself in the Suez Canal and disrupts traffic for some period of time? So we can actually quantify the consequences associated with these and think about ways of mitigating them. Some of the work that I've been most involved with recently is the U.S. Virgin Islands. So for those who haven't had the opportunity to visit, the U.S. Virgin Islands is located just to the east of Puerto Rico, about 1,100 miles from Miami. And in the summer of 2017, there were two back-to-back hurricanes that caused a lot of problems in a lot of places. So in particular, there was Hurricane Irma that a lot of folks heard about because it went up Florida and caused a lot of problems. That was a Category 5 hurricane. And then just 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria, which was known for hitting Puerto Rico. Well, the place where those two storms crossed each other was, in fact, the U.S. Virgin Islands. And not surprisingly, it had a devastating effect on the territory. So we've been working for the last 3 years, sponsored by FEMA and working with the local emergency management agency and the local university to analyze interdependent infrastructure in the U.S. Virgin Islands to assess its resilience and to come up with ways of building it back better. So some of the work that we've been doing, again, in partnership with FEMA, or sponsored by FEMA in partnership with the Department of Energy and some of the national labs, is to look at models of different infrastructure systems. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about those so you have a sense of them. So for the engineers in the audience, right, we have models of electric power generation, transmission, and distribution. And essentially what we do is we build mathematical models that show how all the details of these systems ultimately result in the ability of the system to provide power to the people who need it, or sort of turning it around, minimize the number of people who have to go without power. So these are prescriptive optimization models that essentially say, given the system that you have, given the scenario that you have, what's the best way of operating your system to again, minimize the people who have to go without power. And so what I'm showing you here is the island of St. Croix. And so what we can do is we can look under different scenarios to see how well that system can perform. And we do this in concert with the Virgin Islands Water and Power Authority, WAPA. So we can look at electric power systems and notional failure scenarios, vulnerability, and defensive investments. This is, again, it's an island, it's a modest sized system. So it's actually something that we can study in fair detail. Now, what about water, you might say? Well, again, for the water engineers, the hydrologists, right, we have models of sources and pumps and pipes and junctions and pressure. and storage that allow us to look at how these systems support communities. And we similarly build water models that take details of the physical system, take details of scenarios, and then tell us, given this scenario, what's the best way of operating the system to minimize unmet demand, to minimize low water pressure, which in particular is the case. And again, applying this to the island of St. Croix, we can identify situations where over in Frederiksted, on the west side of the island, like they have chronic low pressure water problems. And so when we do this, right, we ultimately are able to look at how these two systems are interdependent with one another. So that is to say, how the loss of power in the electric power system can affect the pumps, which then affect the tank levels, which then affect the pressures, which then ultimately result in a low water pressure. And sometimes the way that you improve the water system is to actually work on hardening the electric power system. So understanding these interconnections and how they work ends up being really informative for the kind of defensive investments that the local utility and the local community needs to make. And so again, we've also looked at transportation, supply chain, and cell towers. And so this has been a big topic there. Some of the work that we're involved with right now is taking all of these ideas and applying them to military installations. So in particular, my colleague, Dr. Dan Eisenberg, who is the deputy director of our center, is leading a project where we're looking at compound threats to installations. And essentially, we're using the models that we've developed in the Virgin Islands to look at what I'm showing you here is Marine Corps Base Hawaii. So you might have also noticed the pattern that I only choose to go and travel to really nice places. It turns out that's where all the fragile infrastructure is. So I'm happy to travel to Hawaii or the U.S. Virgin Islands or wherever it is. That's a joke, but it's nice to travel to nice places. So a lot of the work that it continues to go on is thinking about the way these interdependent infrastructures support not only function, but ultimately mission. And one of the things that we're finding is that some of the most commonly used measures for importance and vulnerability, things like MissionDependency Index, which is used across all the services, has some very serious flaws in that it is internally inconsistent and often recommends protecting the wrong things. And so we're trying to find ways of overcoming that. In particular, we're working with Naval Facilities Command, NAVFAC, on some of this. Okay, so some of you might now be saying, well, isn't this all just traditional vulnerability analysis? And the answer is, well, yes and no, right? Traditional vulnerability is often focused on things like reliability and risk. Risk in particular is focused on, how do you bring together likelihoods and consequences? Oftentimes you'll see this kind of risk matrix as shown here, where you look at the combination of the product of likelihood and impact, and you want to focus on the high probability, high impact kinds of things. There are various kinds of various kinds of frameworks for doing this. This is one Department of Homeland Security talks about identifying, analyzing, prioritizing, and managing. And so, again, in traditional risk analysis, that's exactly what you do. You identify scenarios and events and threats. You assess likelihoods and impacts. You evaluate the risks. You come up with some scores, and then you decide what it is that you're going to do. The challenge with this is that these kind of techniques rely primarily on past events for these likelihoods, for these scenarios, for these sort of threats that we have in mind. And one of the things that is very true about climate is that we have to get prepared for things that haven't happened before. So one of the real drawbacks of these traditional reliability and risk kind of things is that we can't predefine all the threats. We don't know everything that's going to happen. We are going to be surprised. And so that's where this notion of resilience starts to come in. So in particular, one of the things that you'll see is these sort of traditional notion of resilience, this ability to bounce back, right? The idea is that you have something that's going fine, it crashes, and then we want it to come back. And oftentimes resilience is even this measure right in the middle, right? So how long and how badly did it fail? We find this view of resilience limiting. We think about resilience differently, and we think that you should too. So what I want to tell you about just briefly here is 4 concepts. Robustness and rebound are the ones that are kind of traditionally there. So what's robustness? In the VI, this is like composite power poles. After the storms knock down power poles, we're going to put up stronger power poles. What's rebound? Well, it's the ability to go out and put those power poles up right afterwards. And those are really important things to do, but they're really in the end not enough. And they're not enough because even if we prepare in this way, we're gonna be surprised. One of the things that happened in the VI was that after they put up these composite poles, they had a Category 1 storm that surprised them and knocked some of them down. And it wasn't that the wind knocked them down, but there was debris and other things that they hadn't expected that was causing strikes and causing these things to fail. So how might else we prepare, right? Emergency generators, that seems like a good idea. Does having an emergency generator make us resilient? Because a lot of times, that's what folks say, well, let's just go buy generators. In the end, it's not going to help us if we don't have the fuel to operate it, if we don't know how to use it, if we haven't maintained it. So it's not about the having, right? Here we're getting to the tagline for today, right? Resilience is not about what you have, it's about what you do. It's the processes that you have in place to kind of think about this. And as a result, one of the things that we want you to do is to think about resilience as a verb, not a noun. And it goes with that, one of the things that we try to advocate for is that we don't use the word resiliency, because it tends to reinforce this noun form, this having, as opposed to the doing. So if there's one thing you do take away from this, think about resilience as a verb. So there are other things that we can do. What we really want to learn about is how do we learn to have our systems stretch when they're challenged in ways that are outside of the way that they were originally conceived, when we are surprised. How do we extend and how do we adapt? And that's very much what some of the ongoing work that I'm leading is involved with. So again, funded by the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, looking at how we can make our military installations resilient to climate-driven surprises. So events that we haven't seen before, whether those are simultaneous hurricanes or more destructive wildfires or deep crushing cold. These are the challenges that we're continuously focused on, right? And so again, the key idea is that when we're surprised by extreme events, because they are going to happen, how do we think about architecting our infrastructures, not just the physical assets, but the people and the processes that go with them to handle these challenges that fall outside their design envelope? And so part of what we've been working on is developing new training techniques, exercises, and experience that help folks learn about them in a concrete kind of way. Okay, so I'm up to the end of my time here, and a question that would be totally reasonable to ask is to say, okay, we've been talking about resilience for more than 15 years. If we agree on it, and everyone is, right? Everyone's for resilience. There's nobody who's actually for brittleness. Why don't we have it already? And so what I want to end with here, just talking about 4 barriers for us becoming more resilient. And this is in collaboration with Steve Flynn and David Woods and Tom Seeger and others, right? So the first reason that we might not be resilient is that we don't know how vulnerable we are. We don't know how poorly we're prepared. That could be the reason. In a lot of places, because we're getting surprised all the time, because we're getting hit by storms and other extreme weather events, I think there's a fairly broad recognition that we are vulnerable in ways that we haven't been before, right? So that's okay. The second reason we might not be resilient is that we actually don't know what to do. And that's really where my work and what I've talked about here in this presentation is really about. How do we go about creating resilience for these infrastructure systems that are going to make them better poised to adapt when things are challenging? And so hopefully we're making some progress on that. But even if we know what to do, that might not be enough, right? Because we could still be in a situation where we don't have the right economic incentives to create resilience. We're not incented to invest in the right ways. We don't have access to the capital that we need, right? So even if we know what to do, we may not be able to do it. And then even if we have the resources, oftentimes we find that there are organizational or governance barriers to doing it. The organizations that are in charge of decision-making at the local level, the county level, the state level, they often don't align with the infrastructures or the systems, right? So you have multiple groups that have to be all on board, and getting everyone to move in the same direction is just increasingly hard. And so as much as I focus on barrier number 2, how do we create resilience in these socio-technical systems, I fully recognize that in the end, that's not going to be enough. And so hopefully that's something that Kirsten's going to talk about in the second part of this seminar. So with that, contact information, I'm easily found on the web, and I thank you all for your participation. And I think we're gonna save questions for the end, Alexa, is that right?
Yeah, if you all have questions, I bet you do, because that was so interesting. I know I do. Just go ahead and drop them in the Q&A, and we'll go after.
Yeah, and I'll be
Kirsten.
watching that. Yeah.
Yeah, then we'll circle back to some of your questions. Thank you so much, Dave. That's fascinating, and I'm hearing a whole lot about resilience hubs, and I'm interested in how the private industry plays into this as well. So thank you to Dave, and welcome Kirsten McGregor, who is just a phenomenal person and speaker as well. Very modest for her background, which is a lot longer than what I'm going to cover right now. But just to give you a few highlights on Kirsten, she is a senior fellow at the University of Delaware, Joseph Biden School of Public Policy's Institute for Public Administration. She is or was the senior policy advisor on President Obama's Hurricane Sandy rebuilding task force. And she is the deputy director of the Delaware Economic Development Office. So thank you so much, Kirsten, for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me and also arranging all this, and also for SAME for putting this on and being open to looking at the economic side, because what I'm about to present really complements nicely to what David just presented. So just a little bit more about my company. I founded it after I worked on Hurricane Sandy with the federal government, and I'd been working obviously on disaster recovery from the economic side. And I started my own company. It's based in Wilmington, Delaware, and providing economic recovery and resilience services since 2013. And most of my clients for several years were large companies where I subcontracted to, or they were specific projects for major economic disruptions. So that's the other thing. Economic disruptions aren't necessarily just natural disasters. They can be a sudden and severe layoff of jobs. They can be the manufacturing plant has, an explosion, so that impacts the economy. And now we're seeing with COVID, I see one of the questions earlier was supply chain. So, so this is just about me and my company right now. We've got clients all over doing economic resilience, but for the past, I'm going to see if my thing works here. We said it might not. Is that? I don't think it did. It go? Okay. So today we're going to talk about high level, but it's funny because David and I say the same things in different ways because we're coming from different perspectives. The economic recovery process, the Economic Recovery Foundation, and right now the big topic where everybody's reaching out to me, federally funded, federal funding in general, right, with ARPA and the pending infrastructure bill and some other appropriations that are going on, but also looking at the different federally funded plans. So thank you. So here is a gorgeous photo that I took while working in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And the joke is, must be hard. I lived there for the contract, and it was called, to David's point, it was called a mission assignment. So when I worked with the Department of Commerce, I was missioned assigned to FEMA to run Hurricane Sandy recovery in New Jersey. And then as a consultant, I was brought on for a contract through the U.S. Department of Commerce with a mission assignment to FEMA to work on the recovery of the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I just wrapped up that contract in July and worked on that for about 2.5 years. The funny thing is I'm a mountain person and not a beach person. So actually it was challenging for me to be working in the islands. But David and I did not have the opportunity to work together, but we worked on several projects that overlap. So I've heard him speak before, and he was the first person to talk about the topic, the title of this presentation. It's not what you have, it's what you do. And then I started embracing that and trying to get the word out for my clients and who I work with. Can you do next slide, please? Okay, so, and David mentioned looking at interdependencies with his modeling, and that's true with how we structure this with recovery in general. So Hurricane Sandy was the first rollout of the federal government, the first major rollout. I think they'd done a minor one somewhere, but in New Jersey and New York, where they had the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And this is something we can actually provide some links if anybody wants some more information on this. And it's called NDRF, and they have different sectors that go to the disaster site. So in that case, it was New Jersey or the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and they have different sectors. And not every sector is brought on for every disaster, but they have these 6. And it's important because even though this framework is structured through the federal government, it actually is very similar through frameworks across the country when it comes to disaster recovery. So you've got community planning and capacity building. So governance, leadership, just plans in general. Infrastructure system, which of course is which Dave is directly related to that. Utilities, energy, roads, transportation, and then health and social services. So schools, education, medical, psychological, a lot goes into that. Housing, of course, a lot of blue roofs still, unfortunately, 4 years later in the VI, but looking at housing and is it robust and safe, but also getting them back to safe living where they're not living under blue roofs. And then economic, of course, is my section. So we do a lot, and that's for me, the fun thing about economic is it kind of touches a lot of different things, because everybody wants to know what's the economic output of this, what are the outcomes, how many jobs, what's the ROI of the federal investment, or how much private sector leverage can we have here? So they're always looping in the economic group, and so we end up having our hands in all of these. And then finally, natural and cultural resources. So so for the Virgin Islands, of course, they have it like the picture you saw. They have a beautiful landscape, and that is what drives tourism. So I'm giving you that as an example. If your natural and cultural resources are not robust, that has a direct impact on your economy, whether it's a tourism-based economy or not. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But just real quick, before the poll, all of these are interconnected. So that goes back to actually a lot of what David presented on. So here's a poll we have. I know there's a lot of DoD here. So what sector do you primarily work with? Housing, natural and cultural resources, infrastructure, or lumped in community planning, capacity building, health and social? Do you see the? So it looks like mostly infrastructure, which is not surprising. Mostly, over 3/4 are infrastructure. So a smaller percentage for the other ones. However, all of these are interdependent on one another. You can't just look at the economic in a silo. You can't just look at infrastructure. David alluded to looking at, if you have an asset, you can't just look at the asset, you look at the systems. And then where we look at it even broader are those systems and those impact on the economy, the workforce, the education, business attraction. Economic development as a subject matter is basically, you can sum it up as quality of life. So you want, workforce is going to be attracted to places they want to live, and businesses are going to be attracted where the workforce is, and the governance system is attractive to them. Okay. So my company came up with this, we've kind of been scaling out since the pandemic, as you can imagine. And we were getting a lot of questions. A lot of people were calling me to pick my brain, not even realizing that there was a structure in place for long-term recovery. So the pandemic, though, was, of course, very unique. And I think one of the questions that had come up was, should we be looking, what could we learn from COVID-19? There's a lot, with supply chains. So what we've learned, I'm sure David knows this too, that disasters, whether they're a terrorist attack or a hurricane or wildfire, as you're going through the recovery process, if it's not dealt with in that interconnected cross-sector way, the pre-existing vulnerabilities come out. So I think we've been seeing a lot of things come out during the pandemic, and issues that weren't directly related to the pandemic are now showing that we have to deal with them. So things like supply chain, social equity, so on and so forth. So this is the disruption. This is what people think of. The little bomb there is like the hurricane or the wildfire. And then a lot of places just put a Band-Aid on it. They get their money from the Stafford Act and or whatever, and they deal with it, and that's it. So next slide. So this is where this whole pandemic goes. So you have this ongoing disruption. I mean, the pandemic was the disruption, and it was going on and on and on. Meanwhile, we had earthquake in Puerto Rico, we were having hurricanes, and we had major social justice issues. So where I live in Wilmington, Delaware, the restaurants had finally opened from lockdown, and then they had to be shut down again because there have been riots and a lot of damage. So this is the response only. If you're only going to respond and not incorporate a resilient mindset that David explained, if that mindset is not embraced and practiced, and you're just looking at the short-term response to that disruption, over time, you're going to have this issue with equilibrium, having and this is where the social equity part comes in, the wealthy getting wealthier and the poor getting poorer. And we've already seen that. Next slide, please. So this is where we came up with the recovery process of embracing that resilience and showing that if you start embracing the concepts and ideals that David talked about, not just for infrastructure, I mean, I know he came from that lens, but if you start looking at it from different sectors and embracing the different sectors and showing those interdependencies and having that situational awareness, I mean, you can't know everything, but doing your best to be aware of what's going on with sea level rise, what's going on with the bridges, that type of thing. It becomes that it works together to have the resilience allows for a more prosperous economy. It just happens naturally. So resilience is important. Now, I bring up the natural environment because historically you have groups that are there's this whole push and pull with the economic group and the natural and cultural resources, where actually we've come together working more because they are interdependent on each other. And I think historically they've been seen in conflict, but the economic people need to embrace the natural environment and the challenges facing the natural environment. And that includes, in the middle of that infinity symbol, I would say the stuff that David works on with infrastructure. That's what brings them together, the human component. Next slide. So this is the Economic Recovery Foundation. It applies to all the sectors, and it goes, actually, David mentioned some of these as well. Consequences, coordination, capacity, and capabilities. Next slide, please. So again, this is more of a strategic as opposed to tactical, but looking at those plans and strategies, when you start digging in, you'll realize that there's tons of plans that you didn't even know about. And there's all these different task forces and committees, and they don't even know that the other group is talking about this. So that coordination of at least having that awareness, having coordinated outcomes and leveraging the funding, that's a big thing now, especially with ARPA. So looking at the different funding sources that are out there, because you can't match a federal source to a federal source, but you can certainly match FEMA money to commerce money. Next slide. Capacity. Now, this is something that I learned from working in the islands. And again, even though I'm not an island person, I am a policy advisor to the University of Delaware Island Policy Lab, and I work with a lot of islands because islands are great pilots to learn about how economic recovery works and economic resilience works because of the reasons David talked about. They're highly vulnerable and they're isolated, so there's not as many outside indicators. But the capacity issue is important across the country. We've seen this with ARPA. Some places don't have the capacity to apply for funds, to manage federal funds. Some of them never had to do it outside of entitlement funding. Being transparent about that funding and making sure when they allocate those funds that it's something that can benefit the community for years, not just for 3 years. And then the fundamental basics, and this also goes back to what David said, a lot of these moonshot goals that places are talking about now, those are really important to have those long-term goals. But if your sewage system, your sewer system isn't working and sewage is coming up in your water, you got to focus on the basics first, right? So those fundamentals. Next slide. But that is sort of overlaps with capabilities. So how can the federal government and state agencies look at their grantees or their stakeholders, encouraging best practices, minimum standards, having clear timelines and deadlines, and having clear expectations for the process and deliverables associated with this funding. This does overlap with a lot of that, the consequences and critical components, assets, and interconnected systems that David talked about. Next slide. So the consequences, he brought up consequences, but from a different perspective. But a lot of this, Virgin Islands, I think, got a couple billion. Well, it can't be solved. What we're learning is things can't just be solved by money. And when they do get the money, there has to be oversight of those grants, that they're doing what they say they're going to do. A lot of grants have been pulled, that they understand that, and this is with ARPA, that there are there's no free money. So you got to follow the grant special terms and conditions, that places have support with procurement. There are a lot, I'm seeing this across the country now, that putting out an RFP, they don't know what to put in the RFP to attract the most appropriate contractor, and supports with those scopes of work. Does that scope of work align with the project that you're trying to, so they're usually infrastructure projects. Does the scope of work align with what you're trying to achieve? And when you bring in these contractors, are they doing the work that you intend and those outcomes that are there? Okay, next slide. So poll question. I know that this was more planning, but how often are you involved with a community or a regional planning process? Now, the big thing with the federal government is focused on regional planning. So frequently, occasionally, rarely, or you've never had the pleasure of being part of a community or regional planning process. Okay. So it's about equally mixed, it looks like. Sorry, my allergies have. Yep, so it's about a quarter each. It seems more so. Never had the pleasure. Okay, so we're going to start seeing more of that, especially with ARPA. That even with military and the broader community. So here in Delaware, I was deputy director of the Delaware Economic Development Office, which was in Dover, and an important component of that was the quality of life surrounding Dover Air Force Base. Okay, next slide. So the planning process, and again, I'll keep this high level, but for all sectors, it's that stakeholder identification, making sure it's locally driven, identifying those champions, and David talked about this too, from the infrastructure perspective, that there's engagement across all sectors, and that you come up with outcomes. And again, this is from the economic side, but this is what I think is actually beautiful, is that it complements what David's been saying. So then you research and revise as necessary as you're doing the plan, and you execute the plan, but monitor and adapt as necessary. So none of this, plan that you write and there it goes on the website and you've got these priorities and recommendations. Plans should ideally be something that they should be updated every year and should be adapting to any sort of major disruption or incident. Next slide. So there's types of plans. Obviously, there's tactical, which I think is more aligned with this audience, research, operational, and strategic. And the reason I bring up these different types of plans is having that situational awareness of the different plans that are out there, you may not realize that NOAA did a sea level rise plan that directly impacts land use, or how you would have land use. That there are so many different plans. The more, we found hundreds for the Little Virgin Islands, which has maybe, I think it's now less than 100,000 residents. So it is important to look at, or the Nature Conservancy, they would have a plan that impacted the work that we did because of the return on investment of investing in coral restoration, as an example, something you wouldn't think of. Next slide, please. So again, you'll be able to see this later, but one thing that's being pushed from a policy level in DC is plan alignment. So your transportation, MPO, for the one I'm most familiar with, it's the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. Labor has the Workforce Investment Plan. All the federal agencies have different federally funded plans, and it's typically to identify priority projects to be funded, right? That's not the only reason. It's to get that stakeholder engagement. But what they want to promote is having, the hazard mitigation plan, and this is what we were working on in the Virgin Islands, the hazard mitigation plan, and have that align with the economic plan. And it's much more challenging than one would think. So alignment at a minimum is making sure that you're aware of the plans and strategies and they don't conflict, because what we're seeing is a plan will recommend, this structure will be built here, and it's completely in conflict with another plan where transportation said that's where the road's going to go. It happens more often than you would think. Next slide, please. So federal funding, this is something that I'm getting a lot of calls about now. And I think to the infrastructure question of prioritizing your projects, it is important. And I think having, embracing some of the tools that David talked about, especially for infrastructure projects, it's looking at the systems. It's not just looking at that one project and how the investment of that project, how does that work with other projects, and how does that impact other sectors? So is building that bridge, how is that going to impact the natural environment? How is the tourism aspect with that bridge? Are more tourists going to be traveling there? And so now you got to build up the beach on that other island, things like that. But a lot of communities are not familiar with federal funding, that some of them are reimbursable. Some of them require a local share, and there's a lot of rules about that. You can't match federal money to federal money, except for HUD CDBG, it loses its federal identity. But what the federal government, especially now with ARPA, they really want to see communities, especially regions, leverage funding from different federal agencies for initiatives. Next slide. All right, here's a poll. What federal grant funding source do you or your clients work with most? I figured DOD wasn't known, but agriculture, USDA, DOT, HUD, FEMA, USEDA is who I work with most, who does a lot of infrastructure, or Treasury. They also did BRAC, not so much, so Treasury. Okay. A lot with FEMA. Okay, we can do next slide. So this is the funding example, and I'll do this really quick because I know we're getting towards the end here. I'm using USEDA as an example because they're the darlings right now of federal funding with ARPA. They're being reviewed for a lot more funding right now, but they received $3 billion for regional economic strategies and investments with ARPA, in addition to their general appropriation and the CARES Act. So just high level of how you would deal with, and as a discretionary funding source, you have to pitch your project, you have to talk to the correct person at a regional office, and their regional offices are different than, like FEMA offices. It's just different. They have different eligibility requirements, but basically the rule of thumb is a 501c3 or a university or a government agency. They have a NOFO is the word we use, the notice of funding opportunity. There has to be a nexus to that funding. I talked earlier about in many cases, there has to be a local share. So if the project is, $1 million, EDA would give 800, and you'd have to show proof of 20, and the percentages change depending on the project. They want regional impact because the economy and pandemics, and they don't have a geographic boundary. They want, right now they're pushing transformational. I'm getting the feeling of the Tennessee Valley Authority type of thing, and they want collaborative. They want all levels of government, private sector working together. If it's an infrastructure project, they want to make sure that it's shovel ready. A lot of the things that David was talking about, making sure that that's included. And of course, they want to know, David used the word mission, the vision, the outcomes, what is the overall outcome? Next slide. So again, I know that you can't really see this, but it will be in the handout too. This is just to show you for ARPA how complicated it can be. So even for groups that are familiar with EDA, they broke it into several notice of funding opportunities, NOFOs, that focused on different things. One was called the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, where they're going to announce soon about 50 to 60 awards just for $500,000 for a strategic plan. They received in 6 weeks, they received over 500 applications from regions across the country for these regional plans, because it can leverage more money. And that's the thing. If you start doing these plans and looking at other agencies, it leverages. So next slide. All right, so that's the end. Again, I tried to keep it high level, but if there are people who have more involvement with economic, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I just wanted to keep it higher level. So thank you.
Yes, so thank you, and thank you, Dave. I know that we're at 1:30 here. I'm assuming some people are going to have to pop off the line, and so we've got contact information for Dave and Kirsten here, and they're both open to you contacting them directly for questions. Dave and Kirsten, I know, Dave, you've been answering some of these questions in the Q&A. Did you want to address any of these verbally?
Sure. I was just starting to type a response. So Seth Adamanis writes, as part of the Build Back Better initiative, do you think the government and private industry will start to utilize newer, more environmentally sustainable building systems and materials, or will we continue to rebuild in the same way that we initially built, wood framing, toxic and weak Portland cements, shingled roofs, etc., and expect different results after the next disaster event? So there's a lot loaded into that one. So Seth, I certainly hope that we're going to be taking advantage of newer technologies and more sustainable practices. That level of detail is a little outside of my immediate expertise. But certainly there, at least my experience in the VI is that folks are talking about that. Now, the one caveat I'll say is that as much as these new technologies are great, I think one thing to recognize is that actually some of the older practices make a lot of sense in a regional context, right? So an example of this in the Virgin Islands is that traffic intersections, right? So, one way of managing traffic is to have signals that are coordinated, optimized to, manage fuel or the traffic flow through intersections, coordinating multiple intersections. This is another kind of thing. Like 2 years after the storms in the Virgin Islands, half the intersections were still without electric power. And so even the best technologies there aren't helping. And in fact, if you look at a much older technology, the roundabout, while maybe not optimized, it's very resilient, right? After a storm, all you have to do is clear the debris, and the intersection works just fine. So I think that there is a balance to be had in sort of all of these things. And sometimes it's not always smarter technology that's going to help us be better, but certainly there's a lot more that we can do than just building back exactly the way that it's been before. So that's a great question.
And I just want to build on that too. And again, I come from a slightly different perspective. I think a lot of Seth's comment has been driven by funding, so that there are incentives for for EDA, for example, their investment priorities completely changed with the new administration, and with their investments, with their criteria of reviewing grants. It's to your point, are they environmentally sustainable? And that was not the case, a couple of years ago. And I believe that's the same with FEMA, with brick funding and some other federal agencies as well. So the funding incentives, I do think encourages that. And then to the question of, how would you know about, for the coral reef example, how to identify stakeholders? I think that's the point. Like it's talking to each other. It's learning about different things. It's not keeping yourself in your own silo. That it's not easy, but having that, doing as much as you can to work with other organizations, because the more you learn, the more you realize that there's other groups. I found so many things just by accident. So I think that, again, I think it's a mindset shift. That's what I see resilience building on, David. I see it as a mindset shift to be able to embrace all these intersector.
Mm-hmm. We've got just about 5 minutes before we should probably begin to wrap up. I wonder if either one of you would address the William Hillard's question.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the topic of resilience in conjunction with or versus net zero carbon goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's no reason that net zero carbon goals have to be in conflict with resilience. But the thing that I'll say about resilience, or at least the way that we think about it, is that resilience is not about any particular solution, any particular operating point, any particular way of doing things. It's the ability to switch between them, right? So I think that, as it pertains to, I don't know if we're talking about energy, right? It's being able to it's being able to get your energy in different ways, because any one solution is going to have issues associated with it, right? And so in principle, there's nothing that makes that in conflict with net zero carbon goals. We know there are lots of environmentally friendly sources of energy that we can take advantage of. It's, I would say, not betting everything on any one solution, right? It's having some. It's being able to move between them when you're surprised in ways that you didn't anticipate. And Kirsten may have some more thoughts on that.
Well, I think that just the concept of embracing surprise from the econ sector, that they're actually thinking about that now. But again, I think the incentives are now there. One of the table that I have, and you'll have it in a handout, for the EDA ARPA funding, 300 million of that is set aside for coal communities. So it's to encourage communities that will have coal, based businesses close, that they help the workforce and the governments adapt, because it's going to take time. So they're already proactively thinking about coal plants or coal, shutting down in 5-10 years. So
thank you. And what about this question about tools from Christine here? Can you recommend any good tools or literature to determine the value of natural infrastructure for CBAs?
I'm hoping Kirsten's going to take that.
Which CVA? I just want to make sure I'm. So you mean like ROI? Maybe they could clarify, like ROI. So for natural environment. So the one I was referring to, and that's the thing that you keep learning more and more. That the Nature Conservancy had worked with insurance. So they're trying to put a value on coral so it could be insured. And then FEMA was looking at that. This is why it's important for government. Could then coral in certain cases be paid for by public assistance if it falls in line with it's something that can protect. It works with mitigation. So if you restore coral and it lowers it adapts to the changing with the waves and the sea level rise, then could that be funded by federal agencies? But the ROI on that was tourism, all the different things that coral brings. And it was done internationally. And I think some hotel industries were involved as well. It wasn't just, so that was the interesting part. It wasn't just the Nature Conservancy looking at the ecological part. It was actually looking at natural resources and that impact on the economy and vice versa. I don't know if I answered the right question. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Any final comments, Dave?
I mean, I think just the fact that we're recognizing that infrastructure is more than the physical built stuff, to include environmental infrastructure, to include social infrastructure. These things are all interdependent and working together. So infrastructure week, infrastructure month, infrastructure bills, whatever they are, it's not just about buying stuff, right? Getting back to the beginning, right? It's not just about buying generators. It's not just about the stuff that you have. It's about the stuff that you do. And one of the challenges that we face is that, a lot of these funding grant opportunities make it easy to buy stuff, make it much harder to spend on people and processes. And so if there was something, that we could do, I think, to help, would be to sort of change that some way, so that we could invest in people and processes and training and exercises and make it easy for us to rehearse the way in which we're going to respond to surprise, as opposed to just buying things that are going to go in a warehouse and, may never get used.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just build on that real quick, that's why I focused on planning a lot on my side, the strategic planning, not just economic, but I do think that the federal side is starting to embrace that and encourage that, that regional planning, that cross-sector planning, leveraging funding, because of the process and the people, and using that as a way to identify those infrastructure projects as part of the greater system. So completely agree with that one.
I want to just thank you both for being speakers on this very important topic. I thought it was absolutely exceptionally good. And thank you to all of our attendees. If you have a topic of interest that you'd like the environmental COI to address, Rick Weiss is actually on the line with us today, and he's provided his email address, which is Weiss, W-I-C-E, at Battell, BATTELL.org. Send any topics that you'd like us to address. You've got the contact information for our speakers if you have additional comments or questions and you'd like to follow up with them. And to all of you on the call, I hope to see you in Atlanta at the SAME Small Business Conference. I will be there. I hope to meet you. And thank you for your participation.
Thank you, Alexa, and thanks to everyone for having us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks all.